Before we start our first lab, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the workbook we'll be using. The first thing I'd like to point out is that the workbook contains a very large amount of material, far more than you could ever handle in a single semester. What you're supposed to do is choose the experiments and activities that you want to do, within a certain framework, of course. Part of my job is to help you make your choices. Next, I'd like to mention that in each workbook chapter, there are usually two subsections. The first is called Experiments, and the second is called Activities. In the Experiments section, the workbook gives full instructions for all the experiments, including alternate procedures. Choose the procedure you wish. There's plenty of equipment available. In the Activities section, you will find suggestions for projects that you can do on your own time. You'll see that there are usually no detailed instructions for the activities. You're supposed to do them your own way. If there are no questions, let's turn to Chapter 1 now. Most people think of astronomers as people who spend their time in cold observatories peering through telescopes every night. In fact, a typical astronomer spends most of his or her time analyzing data and may only be at the telescope a few weeks of the year. Some astronomers work on purely theoretical problems and never use a telescope at all. You might not know how rarely images are viewed directly through telescopes. The most common way to observe the skies is to photograph them. The process is very simple. First, a photographic plate is coated with a light-sensitive material. The plate is positioned so that the image received by the telescope is recorded on it. Then the image can be developed, enlarged, and published so that many people can study it. Because most astronomical objects are very remote, the light we receive from them is rather feeble. But by using a telescope as a camera, long time exposures can be made. In this way, objects can be photographed that are 100 times too faint to be seen by just looking through a telescope.
Animated cartoons are a part of every individual's childhood. These motion cartoons are actually the same sequential representation of drawings for computers or TV. Suppose a character's movement is to be animated. A drawing loop is repeated over and over, and then the slides with these drawings are run one after the other. This creates the illusion that the characters are in motion. The superimposed images, one after the other, are shown so quickly that the minuscule differences between the pictures gives the impression that the character is walking or running. The basis of this concept goes back to the Paleolithic cave paintings, in which human and animals are depicted having multiple legs, in order to show that the same creatures are in motion.
I'm going to talk about a train that exemplifies the rise and fall of passenger trains in the United States, the 20th Century Limited. Let me go back just a bit. In 1893, a special train was established to take people from New York to an exposition in Chicago. It was so successful that regular service was then set up between these cities. The inaugural trip of the 20th Century Limited was made in 1902. The train was different from what anyone had ever seen before. It was pulled by a steam engine and had 5 cars, 2 sleepers, a dining car, an observation car, and a baggage car, which, believe it or not, contained a library. The 42 passengers the train could carry were waited on by a large staff. There were even secretaries and a barber on board. It wasn't long before people had to wait 2 years to get a reservation. As time passed, technical improvements shortened the trip by a few hours. Perhaps the biggest technological change occurred in 1945, the switch from steam to diesel engines. By the 1960s, people were traveling by car and airplane. Unfortunately, the great old train didn't survive until the end of the century it was named for.
These days, we take for granted the wide variety of music available on the radio. But this wasn't always the case. In the early days of radio, stations were capable of broadcasting only a narrow range of sounds, which was all right for the human voice, but music didn't sound very good. There was also a great deal of crackling and other static noises that further interfered with the quality of the sound. A man named Edwin Armstrong, who was a music lover, set out to change this. He invented FM radio, a technology that allowed stations to send a broad range of frequencies that greatly improved the quality of the music. Now, you'd think that this would have made him a millionaire. It didn't. Radio stations at that time had invested enormous amounts of money in the old technology, so the last thing they wanted was to invest millions more in the new technology. Nor did they want to have to compete with other radio stations that had a superior sound and could put them out of business. So they pressured the Federal Communications Commission, the department of the United States government that regulates radio stations, to put restrictive regulations on FM radio. The result was that its use was limited to a very small area around New England. Of course, as we all know, Edwin Armstrong's FM technology eventually prevailed and was adopted by thousands of stations around the world. But this took years of court battles, and he never saw how it came to affect the lives of almost everyone.
Humankind has evolved from the ape form to the present human being form over the course of millions of years. So the ideas about life and its evolution further in the future are only speculations. We can, however, predict that distinct mental and physical traits will emerge as a result of the use of technology. Susan Greenfield's first novel, 2121, for example, which has just been released, and which the reviews say is not very encouraging, suggests that evolution is not only a slow and an unsteady process, but also a complex one. Thus, no one would actually be able to predict its exact forms. Basically, even if we could predict what it would be like, we would not be alive to see the changes. Nonetheless, it also suggests that if the present cultural and technical trends persist, or change at a uniform or constant rate, we can expect certain transformations. For instance, Greenfield suggests that the ability that people have to communicate with each other will have decreased because of the use of new technologies such as mobile phones. Greenfield also suggests that our minds might become infantilized due to the excessive use of social media such as Twitter and Facebook.